What's going on? Tectonic Edge here, and a little bit of a different video today. I've got the spoilers up. I've just been looking over them. You know, this new Magic set's got some great stats. They've got a 7-drop colorless, although I don't think it's quite playable in Tron. It just creates 3 creatures. But still, they're printing big colorless sorceries, so my hopes are still up for something good. But in this one, we're going to look at the lore behind this current set. We're going to read through that first story. Magic is back to publishing stories, so we'll take our first look at it here, and it is Harry Potter and the Classes in Session. Well, I knew they borrowed pretty heavily from Harry Potter on this set, but let's see what this says. Give me a second here. All right. In the seemingly endless halls of the Hogwarts, where arcane knowledge from countless centuries lined the shelves that had seen the rise and fall of many a wizard and witch, it seemed as though the only sound on the whole of Jolly of England was the click of heel on stone. Professor Onyx, as she was known here, took a deep breath as she walked, inhaling the smell of old paper and the familiar ozone that always seemed to accompany magic. She needed a break from yet another insufferable meeting. For all the wisdom and learning in this place, it was populated with some remarkably thick-headed individuals. Case in point, despite her considerable renown throughout the wizarding world, the other professors of Hogwarts hadn't recognized Liliana Vess when she introduced herself by an entirely different name. That hadn't surprised her. The school had always been that way, ever since she'd been a student so many years ago, always wrapped up in its own little problems. There was something calming about the weight of all those books, tomes and scrolls around her. They seemed to wrap the place in a kind of hush. When the students arrived, the campus wouldn't be nearly so quiet, but for the moment she savored the sense of solitude as she wandered the restricted section. A rustling sound from up ahead. With a twinge of annoyance, Liliana pictured that perpetually chatting sortie hat. It would most likely be floating around the corner any minute now as she rounded the next bend. Though it wasn't the school's magically animated headgear she saw in the restricted section. "What are you doing here?" she said. The figure froze, their hands still reaching for another book to add to the pile at their feet. Liliana stepped forward. "Students aren't to arrive for another." The words fell away as a streak of purplish light flew from the figure's wand. It grazed her arm, and the room suddenly seemed to buckle and sway as a sickening sensation spread throughout her body. With a gesture of will, she isolated the spell's effect, then quashed it. An amateur's work, yes, but nonetheless, of the 4 houses of Hogwarts, none taught magic of that nature. "So," she said, a swirling current of deathly energy wreathing her wand as she called upon her own magic. "You're not just here for the summer sessions, I take it." The figure was masked. She could see now, the spaces where the eyes should have been were covered only with smooth, flat metal. She'd heard of the Death Eaters, of course. The school was full of concern, whispers that the secret society of mages, the ones obsessed with forbidden magics and power at any cost. She hadn't expected to see one so soon, though. "I know who you are," she said. The intruder looked toward the hall, then back at Liliana. "Then you will know that your days are numbered." "Professor Onyx," a vaguely familiar voice called from the nearby halls. Liliana spun in the direction of the sound. Spell charged, hand raised, Professor Phileas Flitwick stood at the end of the hall, frowning. "Are you all right?" When she turned back, the intruder was gone. Only a pile of books and scrolls on the floor showed that they had ever been there. Liliana collected herself, letting the magic dissipate. This was no time to draw more attention to herself. "Yes, I was just thought I saw something in the restricted section." Have the faculty moved on to the next topic at hand? Flitwick clicked his tongue. His huge dark eyes filled with annoyance. Madam Hooch is insisting on lengthening this year's Quidditch season. Liliana frowned as she touched her arm where the spell had grazed her. Following Professor Flitwick back to the faculty meeting room, she glanced toward the books. Surely we have bigger problems than Quidditch. Quite right, crooned Professor Flitwick. Liliana hardly heard anything else he said. In his chambers on number 8 Privet Drive, Will Kenrith stared helplessly at a towering stack of books on his bed. He'd been trying to choose which one to bring with him. At first it seemed certain that the tome regarding the Chosen One's prophecy was the best bet. But then he had remembered his favorite historical text, the accounting of Bathilda Bagshot. It was now an hour later, and he was no closer to deciding. He ran a hand through his short blonde hair and glanced around the room, his eyes catching on the glowing owl-delivered letter on the table before he shook his head. There was no way to know how long it would be before they returned to Privet Drive, if they ever did. The front door banged open, making Will flinch, and Roran Crinrith strutted inside. Will's sister was just as tall as him, golden hair flowing down her red cape, thrown over her shoulder. She frowned at Will, her gaze flicking to the books still spread out in front of him. How are you still not ready? Just give me a minute, he said. The Chosen One's prophecy. Definitely the Chosen One's prophecy. Rowan picked up the invitation from the table across the room. Golden sparks floated from it, the letter glowing slightly in her hand. You've had 2 weeks, Will. We need to get going. The histories say Hogwarts has existed there for millennia. I'm sure it can wait a few more minutes for us. He glanced back at the books. How could he make do without a counting of Bagshot? Or possibly ours? Rowan groaned. Casmina is probably waiting on us right now. Will sighed. Casmina. The woman had told them all about the things that Hogwarts had to offer. But their letters had come out of nowhere, arriving only a few days after Garuk had been satisfied enough in their security to let them wander on their own. They hadn't spent that much time with her in London, yet now they were supposed to go to an entirely new school on her word alone. Will turned back to his book. I'm sure she'll be fine. We are leaving. Yes, I know. Today, certainly. I just need to... No, Will. Rowan crumpled the invitation in her hand. Now. Will started to speak, but light burst through the room, tendrils of shadow swirling through the air. He squinted against it as it spread out to surround his sister. Behind her, specks of bright blue sky shone in a web of verdant green leaves. Rowan grinned and waved as she stepped, grabbing hold of a portkey, and disappeared. Will clenched his jaw, fighting the pull at his core. But the pull of the portkey was too strong. Soon the same tendrils of light and shadow erupted around him, washing the bed in its ethereal glow. Desperately he grabbed the memoirs of Bathilda Bagshot before the portkey could pull him into a new location. All around him then was light and color and sound unlike any in Privet Drive. He was hurtling through nothing, through everything. The first thing Will heard whenever Rowan had taken them was a high-pitched screech. It was coming from a blur of feathers and talons, a blur that was headed right for them. Will yelped, raising the memoirs as a shield. The bird cut up into the air just before impact, whirling in a wide arc overhead. They were in a clearing, surrounded by dwarfish, gentle-looking trees. At the edge of it stood a familiar figure carrying a crooked staff. After a moment, the bird dropped out of the sky and landed on the woman's shoulder. Hello, Will, Rowan. A spear of sunlight shone over her head, setting her red hair alight. Casmina gave something of a small smile, nodding to him. I see you've both made it, and just in time. Classes will be starting soon. Will looked around. He couldn't see anything but wilderness. So, the school is nearby then? That's right. Kazmina turned and stepped toward the edge of the clearing, just beyond the forbidden forest. We'll see our first torch soon. The first torch? Will wondered. What could that mean? So what's this place like? Asked Rowan, breaking from Will's side to follow her. Are there others like us? It's a very large canvas, Kazmina said. I'm sure there are others. Are you coming, Will? Will clenched his jaw and then marched along behind them. There was, as Kamina had said, a torch. What she hadn't said was that it was massive. More like a tower, really. The silver column rose high above the trees, piercing the brilliant blue sky. Even from the ground, Will could see dancing flames atop the structure as its light rivaling that of the two suns that shone above. As they reached the base, Will brushed a hand against the smooth metal. How do they keep this thing lit? Like most things at Hogwarts, Kazmina said, with magic. Will glanced at the woman, annoyed. Is this your home? I have been with the university for a long time now, but no, Kazmina looked toward the horizon. The next torch should be that way. Will looked in the same direction, but all he could see were the green fields stretching out before them, broken only by a foot-worn path. If there are more torches, you should have time to admire them later, Will. Come on, said Rowan. Running ahead, Rowan slowed down. Said Will. We don't know who or what could be out there. Exactly, she said, laughing. They walked for a few miles before they reached the next torch. Will wondered how many of them there were in the school grounds, and what other stranger lands they might tower over. The storm-writ texts were a lot more thorough, Kazmina said idly. It's a lot of reading. Will started as Kazmina's nearest. He frowned, then followed her gaze to the book at her side. He slid his hand over it, the warm cover giving him a sense of security. I hadn't heard of that one. Well, you can't always consult in the library once we reach Hogwarts. The what? Rowan asked. The library, Kazmina replied. Home to the most extensive collection of knowledge regarding magic anywhere. Oh, said Rowan, not bothering to hide her disappointment. More books. Who cares? Are you joking? Exclaimed Will. We could learn anything. Everything. We've got to pick up the pace. Rowan rolled her eyes. Now, who needs to slow down, Didn't you say there could be beasties out there? My owl would alert me to any approaching danger, said Kazmina. Neither of you have anything to fear. Will glanced at the bird. It flexed its white wings as the light of the suns bounced off its round eyes. In a halting motion, it turned its head to look directly at him. Will frowned. What's wrong with it? Kazmina looked ahead. Nothing at all, although she is getting a bit long in the tooth. Which is funny, because it's a bird. It's an expression for old age, but wouldn't it be long in the beak? They walked the rest of the way in silence, with Will sneaking glances at the owl and her owner. But the bird always seemed to know when he was looking and stared right back until Will couldn't keep himself from looking away. He noted the changing landscape as they moved, spotting a range of reddish-gray mountains in the distance. Finally, Kazmina broke the silence as they passed another torch. Welcome to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. As the trio crested the ridge, Will almost fell on his face at the sight before him. The campus stretched across the horizon, an intricate tangle of gleaming castle towers and rooftops. A massive arch of jagged stone floated over what must have been the center of the school ground, the ends of each stone pointing towards the ground smooth and flat, as if a giant blade had sheared away the bottom. Will stepped to Rowan's side. This is bigger than our castle, Rowan said, her voice low. That's one way to put it. The expanse of Hogwarts was bigger than all houses on Privet Drive, but together at the center of it was an enormous building rose above the rest. Sunlight glinted off the pointed arches while large orbs floated over the shorter buildings. That's the library, Casmina said, coming to stand next to him. Will nodded absently, still speechless as he gazed out over the canvas. Rowan let out a short laugh, jolting him from his revelry. This is going to be good! Will smiled as he followed his sisters toward the looming gates. They were massive enough to seem close, even though it would probably take them another hour of walking to arrive. He'd only taken a few steps when he abruptly realized Casmina wasn't following them. He and Rowan turned back and looked, curious. Aren't you coming? Oh no, Casmina said, shaking her head. She looked to her owl, and the bird took off, flying toward the library. I have other matters to attend to. Look for an old animagus called Minerva McGonagall. She will help you get settled in. Oh, Rowan cleared her throat. Well, thanks then. Will bowed. Oh, wait, I got that backwards. Oh, Rowan cleared her throat. Well, thanks then. Will bowed. What my sister said. Thank you for bringing us here. No need for such formality, Casmina said, smiling. But you are most welcome. Will straightened and glanced at the woman once more before joining his sister. Rowan, he whispered, what do you think an animagus is? On the other side of the gates, the campus behind bustled with activity as people hurried along the wake-stone paths of Hogwarts. Some of the younger students wore identical uniforms. Their black cloaks fluttered behind them as they hurried along. The older ones each garbed in unique outfits and moved in groups, like colors staying close together. Red and gold ruffles and frills stood in the stark contrast with the angles and swirls of the blue and gray coats and spats. Green and silver overcoats and heavy boots seemed to complete opposite of the elegant, narrow yellow and black waistcoats and high collars. Will turned on his heels, taking in the kaleidoscope of moving colors and shapes. She's strange, isn't she? Said Rowan absently. She didn't seem nearly as bowled over by the spectacle around them. If anything, she seemed lost in thought. Who? Casmina and her owl, she shrugged. I guess it doesn't matter anymore. She got us in here, right? Before Will could form a response, shouts rang out from the far side of the canvas. In an instant, Rowan was off, running toward the races. Hey, called Will, starting after her. Wait up! They raced around a corner, only to skid to a stop at the entrance of a small courtyard. Inside, a crowd watched as two groups of students flung spells across a grassy field. The bolts of light and color zipping and spiraling through the air as they narrowly missed their targets. One spell impacted a girl in red and gold, and she started to float, kicking her legs helplessly and waving her arms. Laughter and applause rose up from the crowd. Will stared in horror. I thought this was supposed to be a school! This is brilliant! Rowan finished, grinning. She tugged on the sleeve of a nearby student, a young wizard in black and green. Who's winning? So far, Gryffindor seems to have the advantage, said the student. But I wouldn't get too comfortable if I were them. Those Slytherin can be a vicious lot. Bloodthirsty battling in the middle of campus, sputtered Will. The wizard frowned. This is just a duel. No one's actually going to get hurt. Not badly, anyway. Okay, enough of this, said Will, trying to sound forceful. Rowan, come on. We need to speak to, well, some kind of administrator. A schoolmaster, perhaps. There are classes to join, and surely books we need to acquire, and... Rowan stepped forward, ignoring him completely. Out of the field, a student had fixed his eyes on one of the Gryffindor in red and gold. His hands were raised and his lips moved as he spoke in a low, focused tone. On the tip of his wand, curled black ink began to furrow. Watch out! Shouted Rowan. She sent a jolt of electricity at the one preparing the ink spell. He yelped as it zapped him, causing the black ink he was conjuring to splash all over his uniform. More laughter and applause from the crowd. The Gryffindor students turned and looked at Rowan, surprised. Thanks! Rowan grinned and started to respond. Before Will could warn her, a coil of living ink swept her feet out from under her. She landed on her back, coughing as the air rushed out of her chest for a moment, and peered up to see who had hit her. A student in black and green robes, same as the one she'd shocked. "Stay out of this, first year," hissed the student. The air around Rowan snapped and crackled with electricity as she called up another spell. "Want to try that again?" Back on the sidelines, the wizards leaned over to Will. "So that's your sister?" "I'm afraid so," he said, grimacing. He'd been hoping for quiet, for learning. So far, this was just as bad as the encounter with the Dursleys. "Looks like she's chosen her house." It was true. Rowan was standing on the other side of the Gryffindor students now, hurling sparks across at the others. Reluctantly, Will stepped onto the field, picking his way through the battle, dodging gouts of flame and arrows of light as they flew back and forth. When he finally managed to reach her, he grabbed her arm. "Rowan, this isn't our fight. Let's go." She laughed. "Will you just have some fun? If you actually tried it, we're not here to have fun, Rowan. We need to become better wizards." "Stand aside, first year," came a shout from behind him. He turned just in time to catch an orb of ink in the chest, which exploded and sent him crashing into Rowan. Together they picked themselves off the ground, coughing, and Will looked down in horror. The copy of Memoirs of Bathilda Bagshot that he had in his traveler's pack had fallen out and was dripping with black ink. He knew at once it was ruined. "Okay," Will growled, clenching his jaw. "Maybe this is our fight." Rowan tugged at his feet. "Remember, the match against the Weasley twins?" Will nodded, waving his wand to cast magic. Instantly the air around him dropped several degrees. He let out a breath which fogged in the air. "Let's do it." Rowan turned and lifted her hand, calling forth a spear of lightning that popped and sizzled as it stretched and snaked into the air. Will counted as he set a wave of cold wind and ice to swirl around Rowan's lightning. 1, 2, 3. Will and Rowan moved as one, their magic combining as it arced toward the other students. They didn't seem to be grinning so smugly anymore. Just before it hit the Slytherins, Rowan's lightning flared and snapped, cutting through the ribbons of Will's ice magic. He frowned, but it was just too late to adjust. Rowan's attack was strong, at least. It pierced the shield of light the older Slytherin students had conjured, sending her stumbling backwards. Rowan whooped next to him, but the celebration was short-lived as she spun and used a lash of lightning to knock away another wizard's barbs. Will stared at the spot where their combined magic, the intertwining of spells that had always been able to do, had failed. Something wasn't right. Liliana stood outside Hogwarts, watching the bright parade of students as they passed. She could almost feel the weight of her old Slytherin uniform and pulled absently at her collar, at her professor's coat. Across the way, Professor Trelawney strutted through the great doors, with Professor Sprout next to them. Liliana fell into a step alongside the deans. "Professor Onyx," Professor Sprout nodded in greeting. "How are you settling in with your classes?" "Just fine," Liliana said, "though I've been hearing some disturbing rumors from the students." Trelawney laughed. It was an odd sound, like water streaming over crystals. "Well, young minds are wont to create elaborate tales. I think it's a good sign. Active imaginations and all that." Liliana forced a smile, trying to keep her tone light. "Unless they are also playing dress-up and skulking through the halls, I would say it's a little more than innocent play." "Skulking?" Trelawney arched her brow. "And you've seen one of these people?" She paused. How to answer this? "I saw a stranger in a dark mask on canvas. Whether this one was one of those Death Eaters, however." That word again. It always sounds so serious. "No, we really don't know if these rumors are more than harmless pranks," said Professor Sprout. That magic the masked stranger had slung at her was far from a harmless prank. We shouldn't underestimate them in any case. The other professors and the headmaster should be warned. Surely the school has some line of defense we can employ. "You mean other than Filch?" Professor Trelawney huffed. "I'm sure he'd love to actually have something to do for a change. Maybe then he'll let go of his grudge against me. I was thinking something more than a simple squib." Even if these whatever you call them do present some risk, our students are hardly helpless lambs, said Professor Sprout. They can defend themselves. But who's going to protect them from each other? Said Trelawney, gesturing at a nearby courtyard. Liliana could see errant spells sailing in the sky, and cheering and shouting filled the air. Another duel. Professor Sprout sighed while Trelawney laughed. See, with such talent, I don't think they have anything to fear from the Death Eaters. Professor Trelawney, started Liliana, we should really. Fine. Together, they moved to break up the battle. Trelawney sent a wide swath of water through the crowd, corralling Gryffindor students. Vines and roots shot forth the ground under Professor Sprout's command, pulling children away from each other and binding their hands before they could send any more magic flying. A young boy grumbled as he followed a blonde girl off the field. This isn't Privet Drive, Rowan. Liliana frowned, her gaze sweeping over their clothes. They were out of uniform, and swords hung from their belts. His short hair was just as bright as hers, their eyes and noses mirrored of each other. Privet Drive, he'd said. She knew of a place called Privet, but it wasn't located near Hogsmeade. The girl frowned. I know that, Will, but this isn't home either, and you can't tell me what to do. Can we just go, please, before we get in trouble? Liliana watched as the twins passed her, briefly meeting the boy's gaze. He shot her a nervous smile, then hurried past, pulling his sister along with him. They probably weren't Death Eater agents. But if they were planeswalkers, then maybe they could be of use. When, she corrected herself, trouble arrived at Hogwarts. Will marveled at the walls inside of the student dormitories. Intricate lines raced along the stone, glowing with a soft light. He reached out and traced one of them, the magic tingling against his fingertips. This is it, Rowan said from down the hall. She waved Will over before pushing in the door. Going in after her, Will took in the sturdy walls and the glass windows. Sunlight streamed in, filling the space with a warm glow. 2 beds stood on either side of the room, each neatly made with gray blankets, covering and intersecting golden lines. On the wall behind the door, 2 uniforms hung on racks, matching shoes sitting on the floor beneath them. Rowan dropped onto the bed closest to the door. This is nice, much better than those rocks they called beds at Privet Drive. Will chuckled as he set his books down on the other bed. He sat down, sinking into a plush mattress, and ran his hands along the gleaming stitches. The same glowing lines flowed across the stone walls, carved symbols nestled in the corners, stone flames and trees, stars marching along the ceiling. His attention snagged on the flames, reminding him of the fierce duel outside. He looked down at his hands. Did that spell we cast together seem off to you? Rowan looked from the other bed. What do you mean? I don't know. It was just wasn't the same as back home. Well, we're not back home, remember? Rowan shrugged and planted her feet on the blanket. Besides, it worked, didn't it? What's the big deal? Will shook his head. Yes, it worked, but it should have been smoother, more cohesive. We've done spells together dozens of times, but this time it was as if our magic wasn't cooperating. I wonder if the library will have some answers. Well, you have fun with all that reading, Rowan said. She pulled herself, headed towards the door. This isn't just my problem, Rowan, protested Will. What if being on this world is doing something to affect our magic? My magic's just fine. No, it wasn't, Will stepped forward to his sister. But here we can figure out why. You heard Casmina. This is the most extensive collection of magical knowledge in England. We didn't come here to get in some stupid school feud. Rowan rolled her eyes. Oh, really? What did we come here for? To learn, to get stronger, to take advantage of knowledge and wisdom that Hogwarts has to offer. Will dropped his hands to his sides. We could take all of that back to Privet Drive and help our own people. Rowan only shook her head. That's what you came here for, Will. But I'm not you. We may be twins, but I'm allowed to live my own life. Of course you are, Will sighed. That's not what I meant. After a moment, Rowan turned and left. Will grabbed his books and hurried after her, but as Rowan moved farther down the hall, Will slowed. Maybe he would find his answers on his own. On a bench along a scenic canvas, Casmina watched her owl returning from the dormitories. She could still see the twins in her mind. Their images a bit warped from the shapes of those avian eyes. Hogwarts would offer many possibilities for both. She just needed to see which ones they'd take. Something pulled at her attention, and Casmina closed her eyes, but instead of darkness, her mind filled with red. Another of her owls flew through the air, soaring over a rocky desert. Movement below snagged her gaze. A man climbed the rocks, those red and browns of his clothes helping him blend into the landscape. Behind him, a fox-like creature leapt nimbly up to the side of the formation, only to stop suddenly and drop into a defensive stance. There was a rush of air, and several figures seemed to slide from the shadows, stepping out of the surrounding mesas at impossible angles. They were dressed in dark clothes, a metal mask covering where their faces should be, a sickly purple light coalesced in each of their raised hands, all of which were pointed at the man in the fox thing. Slowly he raised his hands in surrender. Casmina sent a mental command, and her owl followed high overhead as the mages bound the man's arms and dragged them toward a yawning cave mouth waiting ahead. Luca grunted as the mages shoved him into the cave. Milla prowled at his side, her teeth bared and hackles raised. Silently he reached out through their link to soothe her. If she attacked, the mages would think he was an enemy. And while he wasn't sure he'd win the fight, that wasn't what he had come here for. Milla looked up at him, then slowly settled back into weariness. She kept in step with Luca, stepping over age-moldering books that spilled from the bare sacks along the wall. The mages brought him to a large chamber. Stalagmites and stalactites cut through the space like jagged teeth. The ceiling bathed in shadows. Luca stumbled on a loose stone, sending a small shower of pebbles skittering down the slopes behind him. "Quiet!" one of the masked mages hissed at him. He shoved at Luca's shoulder. "Keep moving!" Luca took a breath, trying to smother his own annoyance. Then one of the stalagmites moved. At first he thought he was imagining things, the darkness playing tricks on his mind. Then Luca extended his senses and froze. The pebbly, rigid texture wasn't stone, but some kind of shell. Slowly, whatever it was seemed to unfold, stretching long, spindly legs into the darkness. Behind him, another stalagmite shifted, making a low, chittering sound. They were surrounded. "Keep moving," the mask said. They picked their way through the space, every skittering stone sending their gazes up to the ceiling. Luca tried to envision what the creature looked like when they were active, though the thought of facing off of them in a flash broke back memories of many crawling nightmares that lurked in the cave systems of Gringotts. Accompanying the horror through with an odd familiarity, he couldn't help but feel as though he'd encountered their kind before. The mages yanked Luca to a stop, forcing him to his knees. Milla turned toward the far side of the cavern, dropping to a low snarl. Luca glanced down at her. "Hey, quiet." The crunching of bones pushed through the silence. Footsteps approached, and out of the shadows came a tall, thin figure. Swirling along, almost bird-like mass, hiding his face, were currents of dark, coruscating, I've not encountered that word before, energy. Hope I pronounced it correctly. Luca tried to keep his own expression neutral as the man approached one of the creatures hanging from the ceiling, pausing to caress its shell. "Welcome to Hogwarts, Luca. You know me? I know many things I could teach you." The masked man stepped away from the strange snake toward Luca, "and in exchange, I believe there are things you could do for me." So there you have it. Wizards, the first story of Harry Potter and the class is in session. Wizards definitely pulling a lot from Harry Potter and the Strixhaven set. But yeah, back to regular episodes tomorrow, and happy April Fool's Day.